Hello, welcome to the Gallimaufry, a podcast about history. I'm Will, and with me, as always, is my co-host Nick, and we're coming to you straight from the basement of the carpet shop.
Yes, lovely old carpet shop, which has become my second home now. It's still hot and sticky though.
Carpet shop aside, what are we talking about today?
So today we've got a very exciting topic actually, and I'm going to play you this this musical clip that will give you an idea of what we're going to be discussing.
Arr. So for anybody who didn't get that, and for some reason hasn't read the title of this podcast, this episode we're going to be talking about Barbary pirates.
Yes, today we're going to be talking about the Barbary pirates, or the Barbary corsairs, who were basically a group of republics and nations almost, if you will, based at the sort of north end of Africa, what would be modern-day Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, that region. And basically they were a bunch of quite nasty, naughty people who went around most of Europe and the Mediterranean on their little fast boats, taking people as slaves to sell into the Ottoman Empire, who they were nominally part of. Even though they were pirates, they weren't technically pirates in the traditional sense. They were like state-sponsored pirates.
So these nasty, naughty people from the north of Africa, the areas they came from were what were known at the time as the Barbary States, hence the Barbary pirates, or corsairs.
The Barbary pirates existed from as early as the Crusades all the way through to the sort of early 19th century when they sort of finally met their end.
Yeah, so we have records, don't we, of the ancient Romans having trouble with pirates off in this area of water.
Piracy in this stretch between the southern Europe and Mediterranean and North Africa had always been a problem because it's quite a nice area to sail around and rob people because there's a lot of traffic.
Yeah, it's such a busy stretch of water for so much of human history that it just seems obvious. If you're the pirating type, it could be quite a lucrative area to work.
What is the pirating type?
Well, I think that's what we're here to find out. I think it's probably good to start off by saying that the pirates we're speaking about are not the same pirates who are operating in the Caribbean, who you may be more familiar with. They tend to be ones that get featured more in media, aren't they?
Yes, and that yar sound effect is obviously completely not what a Barbary pirate would have said.
Yeah, less Cornish accent, wasn't there?
Yes, much less.
But that's it.
Although, funny enough, maybe not, but we'll find out a bit later on in the podcast about that. Oh, yeah, spoiler.
Oh, Cornish accents?
Oh, yes. It was probably around the end of the 16th century that the Barbary pirates really started to take off because the ports became solidified around these sort of mini republics, mainly thanks to the efforts of a couple of Ottoman sailors. You may have heard of one of them. He's called Barbarossa.
Yes, wasn't he the painter with the afro?
No, sadly, it was not Bob Ross.
Oh.
Barbarossa. It's actually an Italian word for Redbeard. He was one of two brothers, actually. He had an older brother whose name I will try and pronounce, and I do apologise if... Actually, I'll just say now, I apologise for all of my pronunciations, both Arabic and indeed English.
If you thought the National Health Service episode was bad.
Anyway, so Barbarossa, his real name was Khizr, and he had a brother called Oryx. They helped wrest control of where the Barbary ports were from the Spanish, who basically controlled parts of Algeria and Morocco and other little bits. They'd constantly been falling in and out of, European, Spanish, Portuguese hands and North African hands. But basically in 1571, the Spanish finally said, all right, you can have them. And then from there, the sort of republics and kingdoms solidified themselves and became these sort of areas from where they could launch the attacks. They'd always been launching attacks, but now they had a sort of enclave, if you will, where they could plot and pillage.
And was it around this time that they had the backing of the Ottoman Empire as well?
They were essentially independent states, regencies, republics in some cases, who were controlled by pashas, which are basically generals or high officials in the Ottoman Empire. Or in Algeria, they had someone called a Dey, who was a head of state. But essentially, they were basically outposts of the Ottoman Empire without any actual attachment to the Ottoman Empire. It was actually a very clever way to run things, like having these guys out there causing trouble for your European rivals, and you being able to say, "Oh, actually, we don't really control them." But a lot of European states also use this to their advantage as well. They signed treaties and they paid tributes and they tried to get the Ottoman pirates to raid other rival nation states, particularly the Spanish and Portuguese.
So they were real mercenaries and mercenaries for hire.
Not for hire. Their primary business was attacking ships, taking those ships, selling the ships, but their cargo was the most precious thing, and the cargo was people. So they were essentially one of the largest slave network rings in existence.
So they weren't on the payroll of the Ottomans, but the Ottomans were perhaps encouraging them.
Yes, well, they sold their slaves to the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire, which we haven't actually explained what that is in case you don't know what it is, the Ottoman Empire was one of the sort of largest empires of the period of the time.
We're obviously talking 16th, 17th century, the real golden age of the Barbary pirates, but the Ottoman Empire existed right up until World War One, early 20th century. So it was a very significant empire in world history.
They were basically an empire that lasted quite a fair number of centuries. They eventually came to their end just after the First World War. The First World War caused a whole lot of problems, as it did for a lot of empires and dynasties. But at its height, it encompassed a lot of southeastern Europe. Even, I think it was set up to the gates of Vienna, which included Hungary, Greece, Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, Israel, Egypt. It was a massive thing. And it was run using slaves.
Yeah, so and the Barbary pirates were quite a significant source of slaves for the empire.
Yes, I can't give you a percentage on that. I've not seen their tax records, but yeah. So a lot of the slaves captured by the Barbary pirates were taken to slave auctions, particularly in Algiers. Algiers was quite a hub of activity for that. The Dey, who was the ruler of Algiers, got to pick which slaves he wanted, and the rest got carted off to auction. And then they eventually found their way into the Ottoman Empire, where they became servants of different kinds. Hard labourers, some were sexual, some were turned into soldiers. In fact, one of the most fearsome military units of the Ottoman Empire was the Janissaries. And if you've ever played Civilization, you'll know what that unit does and what that unit is. But they were essentially former Christian slaves that became soldiers and were basically converted to Islam, became apostates, if you will. And they were quite a fearsome fighting force. And they used to go on the Barbary raids as well. So a Barbary raid would be traditionally a sort of galley-type ship. So think back to like a trium that the Romans and Greeks used to use. But it didn't look like a trium, it was slightly different. So it had a slightly raised front and it didn't have as many oars. So they were rowed by slaves, but they were incredibly fast and nimble, and they had one sail. And they had minimal light armaments. So they had a couple of guns on deck and a cannon, and then about 100 or so soldiers, Janissaries, who would board the ships and take slaves.
These galleys, were they camouflaged in any way? Were they pretending to be legitimate ships, or was it quite clear that it was a pirate ship approaching?
Logically, if you saw a galley, you probably know it's a pirate. But they were so nimble, so fast. They were a lot faster than, say, the traditional heavier merchant ships. They were attacking from the west. All the different republics had different hunting grounds, but essentially it was that sort of covered that whole Mediterranean, whole southern Europe, and then eventually they stretched out a bit further than that. As they captured more and more Western sailors had a fondness for obviously using the bigger fixed rig ships, the ones we think of when we think of pirates, and they used these to travel further distances, so all the way to the Americas even, all the way to Ireland and Iceland even, to capture slaves. So it was a common fear from about the 15th century to the 18th century that if you lived on a coastal village, you could be taken captive and be, become a slave in the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things which is not necessarily that well appreciated, how far the Barbary pirates travelled. We have records of them raiding British coastal towns in Devon and Cornwall, taking slaves away. I'm not sure that's necessarily that well known, though, in Britain.
There are estimates across 3 centuries of the Corsairs operating that there was upwards of more than 1 million European slaves.
So we're all quite familiar with the Atlantic slave trade and the appalling conditions that the slaves had to endure. What was it like as a slave who had been captured by the Barbary pirates at the time?
So life for a Barbary slave wasn't easy, it was hard. If you were a galley slave, it wasn't a picnic.
No.
And a lot of slaves ended up doing hard labour and different things. Compared to the West, I wouldn't say it was any better. However, the Ottoman Empire did have this view of the world that freeing a slave was a noble art, and that slaves could work off and become Muslim and free themselves.
So we do have records, don't we, of slaves who have converted to Islam and then become pirates themselves.
Yes, so they were called apostates rather than converts, which is a nicer word for it. Back then, religion was everything,
Yeah.
and religion was your life. And if you turned around and basically said, I don't believe in God anymore, I don't believe in the Christian version of God, I'm now Muslim, that was a massive deal.
Yeah.
It's easy for people to look back and go, oh, if you wanted an easier life, why don't you just say you're a Muslim? Because you were essentially sticking up two fingers to God and damning yourself to hell. And the vast majority of Christian slaves didn't want to go to hell. Once the own current hell of their life they were enduring was happening. So a lot of people didn't convert. But at the same time, there were also a great number of sailors who did choose to convert just because life was actually better. They got better living conditions. They were treated better at home. And they were treated as equal because you were now part of the Islamic faith. But of course, you had to give up essentially who you were, your religion.
There's a story about a man called Jack Ward. He was a sailor in Britain, and he, with 30 of his shipmates, they commandeered a ship in Portsmouth Harbour, spent a bit of time kind of terrorising the waters around Britain before travelling to North Africa. I believe he ended up in Tunis, where he converted to Islam. He changed his name. He ended up on quite good terms with the local Ottoman government, doing sort of odd jobs for them. But
That's doing odd jobs.
odd jobs, you know,
Painting the walls, taking some slaves,
this and that,
fixing the windows.
cash in hand, you know. But yeah, he's an example we have of somebody who voluntarily travelled there to become a Barbary pirate because it was obviously, to him at least, it was deemed quite a lucrative lifestyle and better than the life he would have had in Britain as a sailor.
One of the other most famous ones was actually a Dutch convert called Jan Janszoon von Haarlem. He got captured in about 1618 and converted and began serving as a pirate, and eventually rose to the point where he helped found the Republic of Sala, or spelt S-A-L-E, on that north coast, which became a sort of another pirate capital. And he was incredibly successful. He led raids on Ireland and won even all the way to Iceland. He travelled all the way to an island called Heimaey and basically enslaved a load of people and took them back all the way back to the Barbary coast. We have an account of one of his raids actually from Reverend Olafar, who described in great detail of how they came aboard, were quite brutal in suppressing any resistance, enslaved everyone. But he did note that, and this is quoted from his diary, some are not of Turkish origin at all, but a Christian people who have forsaken their religion. Although they dress like the Turkish, they are by far the worst of the people and are cruelly brutal to Christians. The Turkish themselves are not very wicked-looking people. Rather, they are quiet and well-tempered, and they are kind-hearted to the women and children on board the ships. Although he did also say that this does not make the story any happier.
So interestingly, some of these slaves, especially those from more well-off families, could be returned home in exchange for a ransom. And this became so prolific that an order was set up in order to help facilitate this, called the Trinitarian Order. And what they would do is they would help the families raise the funds they need in order to get their family members back. And there's actually cases of certain people being enslaved and ransomed several times throughout their lives, just going sort of back and forth. Must have been very expensive for their families. I'm sure they weren't very happy about that.
That's a rubbish second home, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, you kind of feel, get enslaved once, that's unfortunate. Get enslaved twice, maybe you're being a bit careless. But there are records.
Were there any records where they just sort of stopped? They're just like, just ignore it.
You'd hope so, wouldn't you? At one point, they'd go, look, we spend enough money on you. But yeah, there are people 3, 4, 5 times enslaved, and then the ransom paid, and they go home. You know what? If after the second time, I'd just be like, no, I'm going to stay away from the sea now. I'm just going to stay in that. I'm going to take all my holidays in Nottingham now.
It's just no seaside for me.
It's, Nottingham isn't the point in Britain that's furthest away from the coast in all directions.
Aren't your family from Nottingham?
They are.
You would know then, wouldn't you?
Yeah, maybe that's why.
Yeah.
Sick of those pirates. It's, yes, the Trinitarian Order. They're interesting. They are still a current order.
Do they have an Instagram?
You'd hope so, wouldn't you? You'd hope that these Catholic orders would stay up to date. But they were considered quite successfully in what they did, and they were sort of quite a useful service, I imagine.
Yeah, if you were rich.
If you were rich. If you weren't rich, you just have to get used to being a slave, I guess.
Or give up your religion.
Or give up your religion.
Yeah.
Or
Damning yourself to eternal hell.
be very good at digging.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a period in history where slavery was commonplace. It wasn't just the Barbary pirates. It was common throughout the world. But the Barbary pirates, they continued this practice for hundreds of years until we get to about the early 19th century. And then suddenly the Americans are on the global scene.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't want to create the impression that the Americans sort of rode in on their massive warships and said, "We'll stop this slavery business." Well, actually, that's not what American sounds like. We'll stop this slavery business. It's
They're a
even
bit
worse.
more, yeehaw! Okay, it's just... Now that we have alienated any Americans who may be listening.
We do love. I personally love America. It's a
Yeah.
great place.
We have nothing but respect for the Americans and their funny
So-
voices.
Well, they could say the same of us.
They can. I
They
work
can.
with an American lady, and she does say the same of us.
Oh, well, that's comforting. Anyway, the Americans turn up on the scene. Obviously, they threw off the yoke of British oppression. Of course, in doing so, they also threw off all the protections that being associated with Britain was afforded to them. Around the sort of end of the 17th century, Britain and France had managed to, not together obviously, but separately managed to negotiate treaties with the Barbary pirates, basically saying, leave us alone. And that obviously led the Barbary pirates to intensify targeting other nations, like Spain, Portugal, but also further afield, like the American shipping lanes.
So America has achieved its independence from Britain, but also in that they are no longer under the protection of Britain. They're out on their own, and suddenly they're fair game for the Barbary pirates.
Exactly it, yeah. So when the States fought the war, the UK, sorry. So when the States fought the war with England and the Empire, they had a continental navy, but that got disbanded pretty quickly after they won. They were a new country. Back then, America was poor, like properly poor. Couldn't afford all the big military items that it has now. They didn't have a navy, and when their shipping went, obviously off to trade with the rest of the world, the Barbary pirates went, "Oh, we'll have that, and we'll have your people as well." And so they started attacking them. And obviously this led to the Americans going, basically, we haven't got a navy, what do? Let's pay them money. And actually by this time, by the sort of 17th century, 18th century, a lot of states were paying tribute to the Barbary pirates to stop their shipping being attacked. Thomas Jefferson, when he ran for president, basically said, look, we shouldn't be doing this. We should be using that money to make our own navy, which when elected he did. He founded the U.S. Navy. So the U.S. Navy was directly founded because of the Barbary pirates.
And this, of course, leads us to the Barbary Wars.
So the first Barbary War began in 1801 and finished in 1805. And effectively it saw the US Navy test out their new toys. They sent ships to attack the Barbary ports and blockade them, and kind of ended up losing a couple of ships, and the crews got enslaved. But by the end of the war, they got their crews back. They'd arranged a deal with the pirates so they'd stop attacking them. And there was largely peace for about 10 years. But then the pirates started to attack again. And this was largely because of the British. Maybe saying, maybe you should attack the Americans again. Can't think why they'd want to do that. So you have the start of the Second Barbary War in 1815. But you can't really call it a war because it lasted only 3 days. And the Americans won this war because they had just superior firepower. And it was incredibly costly for the Barbary pirates because it sent a signal out to every other European nation that they didn't have to pay anymore. A lot of the nations had developed better ways of fighting, better technologies, mainly thanks to wars. And they decided it was, enough was enough. And it eventually led to their decline in conquest because the French decided, I like the look of Algeria, I'll have that. And, Tunisia, Yeah, so all the European nations started looking at Africa as places they could have. And they used their strength to sort of put an end to the pirates, basically.
Yeah, and that's the end of our golden age.
You could argue that the next phase of piracy moved on to land piracy, where the Europeans just invaded and took over large swaths of Africa and India and Asia. Basically, yeah, they became the new pirates.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good story for another day.
I wouldn't say a good story.
An incredibly depressing story for another
Yeah, that's more like it.
But
that's right up my alley.
Yeah, I mean that was really kind of the peak of European imperialism, wasn't it? Following that, so it made life quite hard for the fledgling Barbary pirate who wanted to get ahead in the world.
Well, yeah, if you destroy their profession, it's going to be harder to get into it again.
Yeah,
but you know, pirates exist in all forms, in some forms. You know, the old torrents.
Oh yes.
Bit of a stretch though. It's not really the same as enslaving someone. No matter what the ads try and tell you.
I don't know. Would you steal a car? Would you steal a handbag?
Would you steal the person holding the handbag?
Would you steal my heart?
No, you can keep it. You're right.
Now, this is the part of the podcast where Nick and I discuss facts that really stood out to us when we were doing our research. So, Nick, what is your interesting fact?
Well, I hope it's interesting, because I've actually realised that my fact about the US Navy is probably more interesting. But we've already said that. But this is actually around the actual word of Barbary, because a lot of people, you hear a word and then you don't realise that it's related to another word. So obviously Barbary comes from the word barbarian. And we all know what a barbarian is. It's someone who doesn't speak Greek.
I mean, to be fair, I don't think the Barbary pirates were known for speaking Greek.
No, they weren't. That's very true. You're very perceptive there. But basically, the word barbarian comes from Greek, but it was also how the people of North Africa got their name. They were called the Berbers, which derives from the Greek word for barbarian. And gradually, the word barbarians came to mean uncivilized people because they don't speak your language. So it's used by the Romans as well, and then gradually by the European powers to refer to this region as the Barbarian Coast or the Barbary Coast, named for its people, the Berbers, who were barbarians, and also because they fit the bill of the Western view of a barbarian as someone who was savage, who came over, who didn't follow their religion, didn't speak their language, and stole all their stuff. And that's my confused jumble of facts, or hopefully fact. So what's yours, Will?
So my fact, I thought this was quite interesting. So I assume most people are familiar with the book Don Quixote, very famous book from Spain by Miguel de Cervantes. But a lot of people aren't aware of is that Miguel de Cervantes was actually captured by Barbary pirates. He was taken back to Algiers, and because he was from quite a well-off family, he was held to ransom. And his family, with the help of the Trinitarians, who we mentioned earlier, were able to raise the ransom and bring him back. And then he went on to write Don Quixote. So if you're a fan of Don Quixote, then that was probably quite nice. Otherwise, there'd be no Don Quixote.
I've actually read Don Quixote. Does any of his experiences factor in?
Don Quixote is one of those books. You buy it and you think, I'll read that. But it's quite a big book. You go, I'll read that, but I'll read that later when I have time. And it just never happens.
Maybe he nicked the story of someone else who was captured. So I'll have that.
Oh, that would be a good twist, wouldn't it?
I'm not by any way implying that's fact.
You would have heard it here, Miguel Cervantes, plagiarist. What do you think about that, Spain? We have upset the Americans already, let's upset the Spanish.
Who else is there to upset that's worth upsetting them?
Well, you pronounced that Dutch name a bit weirdly,
I like
didn't you?
The Dutch. Very close.
So this is the part of the podcast where we discuss myths and misnomers about the topic at hand. So, Nick, what myths would we like to dispel about Barbary pirates?
The problem with this particular topic is that a lot of the stuff written about the Barbary pirates was written from the perspective of the West. Christian writers writing in the 1700s, still Western authors writing in the early 19th, 20th century when they were still holding those views of the sort of Islamic society and that sort of region of North Africa as being quite barbarous and uncivilized. So there's always a bit of an inherent bias. And there's a particularly large amount of literature and drawings from the time written about the cruelty of the Barbary pirates. And, some of them were cruel. Some of them did torture people, same as any of the other Western civilizations. But they're often seen as, cruel and vile and inhuman. And from different contemporary accounts, and from what we can gather, is that they weren't as cruel as people made out, mainly because if you're capturing a slave and you're torturing them and damaging them, they're not going to be worth a lot of money to sell. And, the contemporary accounts show that they treated a lot of people quite well.
It's not like anyone is saying that they were doing them a favour by enslaving them and then looking after them. It was still a terrible thing to happen to a person. And
Exactly, yeah. You don't want your life taken away.
yeah. There's a certain amount of propaganda on both sides. I think that became quite evident when we were doing our research on this topic.
Yeah. One of the other things we've also touched upon, I believe you're going to talk about, is about how they were all labelled as Turks.
Yeah, so if we were having this conversation back in the 16th or 17th century, we may not be referring to the Barbary pirates, but rather to the Turks. And that doesn't mean that we're talking specifically about pirates who came from what we know today as modern-day Turkey. But Turk was rather a sort of broad term that was used at the time, specifically in Britain, to refer to the Islamic world.
Well, that was fascinating stuff, wasn't it, Will? I'm sure we've learned something, and I hope you've learned something. Have you learned something?
I'd like to think so, yeah.
I've learned something. I've learned that you definitely don't read the books on your bookcase.
No, I don't. It's been rumbled. No, I found it interesting. Before we did this, when I thought of pirates, I thought of Johnny Depp. And maybe I thought about Blackbeard and, all those kind of yo-ho pirates around the Caribbean, But there was a whole different group of pirates operating in the Mediterranean.
Well, it's comforting to know that at least one person has learned something, even if that one person was the co-host who was supposed to know some of the things they were talking about. But that's great stuff. It's all a learning experience. It's probably a good time to mention that my entire history degree was probably 3 years of piracy. Not that I spent 3 years robbing my university for a degree. I meant I just studied about pirates.
I know. My mum was convinced that you were training to be a pirate at one point.
Well, I could become one. And that's our exciting topic for this week. Our next episode will be moving from people in cages to our furry friends in cages, because we'll be talking about public zoos.
That's right. We'll be going from pirates to parakeets as we discuss what led up to the opening of the first public zoos. And that's our show. I hope you've enjoyed it. Hopefully we'll be back soon from our basement under the carpet shop. Please subscribe to us on your usual podcast app, whatever that may be. Visit our website at thegallimorphery.show or drop us an email at info@thegallimorphery.show. We'll be back soon, but from me and Nick, thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon for another hodgepodge to delve into history.
Oh, you did that magnificently.
Thank you very much.
Oh, and by the way, instantly, if you are listening and you need a carpet.
Oh yeah, I know a guy. See you soon.